Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat.
Great to be back.
Today we're diving deep into Chapter 9 of Applied Behavior Analysis for Teachers. This one's all about arranging consequences that actually decrease behavior.
Yeah, tackling those challenging behaviors, we're aiming to sort of unpack the science behind reducing them.
Think of this as your cheat sheet, really. We want to break down the strategies, explain the key ideas in plain language, and give you some, practical examples you might actually use.
Exactly. Our mission is to give you a clear, insightful, and applicable understanding of these techniques. Without getting too bogged down in jargon, we'll look at everything from the positive reinforcement approaches right through to, well, the more aversive strategies.
Though we should probably stress those aversive ones are rarely the right fit for schools.
Oh, absolutely. Least intrusive first, always. So the sources for this are basically page 250 onwards in Chapter 9, covering the learning outcomes and outline right up to the guidelines for overcorrection on page 286.
Okay, let's kick off with level I, reinforcement-based strategies.
Right. This is where we use reinforcement, maybe counterintuitively, to make a behavior happen less.
It sounds a bit strange at first, doesn't it? Using rewards to decrease something. But the first one is differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior, DRL. What's the main idea there?
So DRL, it's basically about reinforcing when a behavior occurs less often. It's super useful for behaviors that are okay in moderation, maybe even good, but they just happen way too much.
Like asking questions is good, but asking 50 questions in an hour, maybe not so much.
Exactly. You don't want to stop the questioning, just reduce the rate. The book mentions the old lab version, int-response time DRL, but how does it usually look in a classroom?
Right, the practical stuff.
Yeah, so in schools, you're more likely to see full session DRL or interval DRL. Full session means, say, the student gets reinforcement at the end of the whole period if they kept the behavior below a certain limit for that entire time. Interval DRL breaks it down, smaller chunks of time. If they meet the criterion within that interval, they get reinforced for that interval. Maybe makes it a bit easier to earn reinforcement along the way.
That makes sense. The book gives that example of Jenny interrupting. Baseline was 9 times, the goal was 2.
Right, and the teacher used extra tokens as the reward if Jenny interrupted 2 times or fewer.
And they mentioned interval DRL could be used to make it more gradual, which links to that changing criterion design idea.
Spot on. A changing criterion design is like slowly raising the bar. With DRL, you do the same. Jenny's at 9 interruptions. Okay, maybe first we reinforce 6 or fewer once she gets that.
Lower it again, maybe 4 or fewer.
Precisely. Step by step, you shape the behavior down to the target level. It's progressive.
The chapter had other examples too, didn't it? The boy reducing talkouts for playtime, the high school girls cutting down on inappropriate chat for a free period, shows it works across ages and behaviors.
Definitely. And if you're thinking of using DRL, Rep and Dietz gave some key steps. First, got to get that baseline data. You need to know the starting point.
Thanks, Sam.
Second, set criteria that are, reasonably spaced, challenging, but achievable. Don't want to set the student up to fail.
Good point.
And third, decide about feedback. Are you going to tell the student how they're doing along the way? Okay, you've only interrupted once so far, that kind of thing.
Right. So pros, it uses reinforcement. It's gradual, adjustable. Cons, not super fast and probably not for anything dangerous.
Exactly. Which brings us to the next one. Differential reinforcement of other behaviors, or DRO.
Okay, DRO. This one sounds like we're focusing on when the behavior doesn't happen at all.
That's it. You reinforce the absence of the target behavior for a specific time period, sometimes called differential reinforcement of 0 rates, or omission training. No behavior reward.
The book had that story about Miss Keel and Stacy. Stacy kept asking, is this right? All the time.
Yeah, seeking reassurance constantly. So Miss Keel used DRO. She reinforced Stacy if she raised her hand for help 3 times or fewer during the morning. Basically, reinforcing the absence of the excessive reassurance, seeking without hand raising.
And the reward was getting to clean the blackboards, which Stacy apparently liked.
Hey, whatever works. And like DRL, there are variations. Full session DRO, the behavior has to be gone for the whole period.
Or interval DRO.
Right, break it into smaller intervals. Reinforcement for each interval, the behavior doesn't occur. You can even use permanent product data, like reinforcing if a worksheet has no doodles on it, if doodling was the target.
The book also mentioned whole interval versus momentary DRO, and that example of Mr. Bird and Clarence, the student who hit others. Using a 7-minute timer, resetting it if hitting occurred. That painted a clear picture.
It did, and it highlights an important consideration for DRO. What happens if the behavior does occur? Resetting the interval is common.
What else should we be thinking about with DRO? Seems like there could be pitfalls.
Definitely. One big one is potentially reinforcing other inappropriate behaviors accidentally. If you're only focused on stopping, say, hitting, the student might start kicking instead. And if the DRO interval ends, then, whoops.
Okay, so you reinforce the kicking because the hitting didn't happen in that interval.
Could happen. Also, you might create a sort of behavior vacuum if you just stop one behavior but don't teach a good replacement.
The old behavior might just pop back up later.
Very possible, which is why DRO is often paired with teaching alternatives. And, crucially, the reinforcer needs to be powerful, really worth it for the student to not do the behavior.
The studies mentioned, like Sullivan and Rohn with adolescents, Higgins et al., with a third grader, they show it working in practice. And the steps for using it. Baseline again?
Yep, baseline first. Then figure out that initial interval length, often based on the average time between the problem behaviors at baseline. Then decide how you'll increase the interval as the student succeeds.
And deciding about resetting the timer is key. Plus, that advice to not reinforce right after some other really bad behavior, even if the DRO interval was technically met for the target one.
Good practice, definitely. Keeps things clear.
All right, moving on. Next up are DRA and DRI, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior and incompatible behavior. These sound much more focused on teaching what to do.
Exactly. They're about strengthening a replacement behavior. With DRI, the I is for incompatible. You reinforce a behavior that physically cannot happen at the same time as the problem behavior.
Like reinforcing sitting in your seat when the problem is wandering around the room. Can't do both simultaneously.
Perfect example. Or reinforcing hands in pockets if the issue is hitting makes the problem behavior physically impossible while the good one is happening.
The praise notes example for reducing littering and running in the lunchroom by reinforcing appropriate sitting sounds like DRI.
It does. And the steps. Choose a truly incompatible behavior, or at least a beneficial one if there's no direct opposite. Get baseline on both behaviors, the problem one and the replacement. Plan your reinforcement schedule and how you'll fin it later.
Okay, so DRI is about physical incompatibility. How is DRA different? The A is for alternative.
DRA is a bit broader. It's about reinforcing a more appropriate alternative behavior that serves the same function or meets the same need as the problem behavior. It doesn't have to be physically incompatible.
So function is key here. If a student tantrums to get attention, DRA might involve teaching them to ask for attention appropriately.
Precisely. You're providing a better way to get the same outcome. And the chapter notes that often with DRA, you don't even need to use extinction for the problem behavior. You just make the alternative so much more rewarding.
Like that study by Kunavatana and colleagues. Manipulating reinforcer quality for kids with ASD.
Exactly. Make the good behavior pay off better. For older students, DRA often targets things like social skills, following directions. For younger kids, or those with communication issues, we often see functional communication training, FCT.
Tell us more about FCT.
FCT is really a specific type of DRA. You teach a communication response like using a word, a sign, a picture card to replace the problem behavior.
Yeah.
Usually, the problem behavior was serving a communication purpose anyway, like getting something or escaping something.
The Matter and Zarcone example with the boys with autism learning to request items instead of having meltdowns fits perfectly.
Classic FCT. And the chapter gives a great checklist for picking that alternative behavior for DRA, DRI, or FCT. It needs to
serve the same function.
Be more appropriate.
Take equal or less effort.
Get the same type and amount of reinforcement.
On the same or better schedule.
With no greater delay.
And hopefully get picked up by natural reinforcers eventually.
Woo! It's a lot, but it really drives home how carefully you need to select and design that alternative. Make it work for the student.
Okay, last one in level I. Non-Contingent Reinforcement, or NCR. This one can feel a bit odd sometimes.
It can. With NCR, you're providing the reinforcer that maintains the problem behavior, but you're doing it on a set time schedule, completely independent of the student's behavior.
So if a student calls out for attention, the teacher gives attention every, say, 5 minutes, whether the student called out or not.
Exactly. Or if tantrums are about escaping tasks, you give scheduled breaks before the tantrum even starts. The idea is, if the student gets the reinforcer freely, the need to perform the problem behavior to get it disappears. It basically puts the problem behavior on extinction.
The chapter mentions some argue it's not technically reinforcement, since no specific behavior is being systematically strengthened.
That's a fair point, terminology-wise, but practically it often reduces the problem behavior by reducing the motivation for it, and it's often combined with DRA.
So you give the reinforcer non-contingently, and you teach an appropriate way to ask for it.
Best of both worlds, potentially. NCR uses time schedules, fixed time, FT, like every 5 minutes, or variable time, BT, averaging every 5 minutes. You usually start dense, give the reinforcer often, then gradually thin the schedule.
What about accidentally rewarding the bad behavior if it happens right when the scheduled reward is due? Adventitious reinforcement.
Yeah, that's a potential risk you have to watch for. But overall, NCR is a pretty common function-based intervention. The studies mention Knoll and Rubo with perseverative speech, more et al. With disruptive behavior and escape breaks show its effectiveness.
Even Mrs. Elliott reinforcing the kids for appropriate shopping behavior kind of feels like NCR giving positive attention before problems start.
You could see it that way, yeah. Proactively meeting the likely function.
Okay, that's level I. A lot of really positive teaching-focused strategies there. It really emphasizes that we should always be starting here.
Absolutely. These should be the first tools out of the box. Build skills, reinforce positive behaviors.
Now, we're kind of tight on time, so we probably can't dive quite as deep into the next levels, but we should definitely give an overview. Level 2 is extinction.
Right. Extinction is basically withholding the reinforcer that was maintaining the behavior. If a behavior was happening to get attention, you stop giving attention for it. Ignoring is the classic example.
But it has to match the function, right?
Yeah.
Ignore attention-seeking, don't give the tangible item if that was the function, etc.
Crucial point. And extinction isn't always easy. The chapter talks about challenges.
Like the extinction burst, where the behavior gets worse before it gets better.
Yep, expect that temporary increase. And resistance, it might take a while to work, especially if the behavior was reinforced intermittently before.
And spontaneous recovery, the behavior might just reappear later out of the blue.
Plus, things like aggression can pop up, or other kids might imitate or reinforce the behavior, and you have to control all sources of reinforcement, which can be tough.
Sensory extinction, too, removing the sensory consequence, like gloves for skin picking. Tricky stuff. It's definitely best used alongside reinforcement for other behaviors.
Always. Don't just extinguish. Teach something better, too.
Okay, level 3, removal of desirable stimuli. That sounds more like punishment.
It falls under the punishment umbrella, yes. It involves taking away something the student likes after the problem behavior occurs. 2 main types here.
Response costs.
Right, like a fine. Losing tokens, losing privileges. If you have a system where reinforcers are earned, response cost means you can lose some for specific behaviors.
Seems like it could be effective, but the chapter mentioned cautions, like making sure you can take the reinforcer away, not making penalties too harsh, and figuring what happens if they lose everything.
All very important practical points. The other level 3 strategy is timeout.
Timeout. Denying access to reinforcement for a period. But the key is, there has to be reinforcement available in the time-in setting for timeout to actually work.
Right. Absolutely. If the classroom is boring or aversive, timeout might actually be reinforcing. The chapter breaks it down into non-exclusion, staying in the area but losing access, like head down or timeout ribbon, and exclusion, being removed from the area.
And it touches on the controversial history of timeout rooms, seclusionary timeout, and all the legal and ethical guidelines around that now.
Very important safeguards. Timeout needs careful planning and isn't always effective if not done right, as Miss Sutton's hallway timeout examples showed.
Yeah, getting reinforced by chatting in the hall isn't exactly the goal. Okay, finally, level 4. Presentation of aversive stimuli.
This is what most people probably think of as punishment, adding something unpleasant after a behavior.
The chapter is pretty clear that this level should be a last resort in schools.
Extremely clear. Ethical concerns, potential negative side effects. It's strongly cautioned against for routine use. Justified only in really extreme cases, safety risks, long-standing problems, and only after positive approaches have failed.
And even then, there's a whole list of guidelines. Consent, qualified professionals, review, documentation, pairing with reinforcement.
It's a serious intervention. The chapter talks about unconditioned aversives, things naturally unpleasant like pain, loud noises, maybe even harsh verbal reprimands, and conditioned aversives, things that become unpleasant through association, like a warning tone or the look.
Reprimands are common, but even their effectiveness depends on how they're delivered. And the downsides are significant. Aggression, withdrawal, fear, modeling bad behavior.
Huge potential downsides. Punishment often just suppresses behavior when the punisher is around, as Professor Grundy found out. It doesn't really teach what to do instead.
Okay, one last specific procedure mentioned under the more aversive umbrella. Overcorrection.
Right. Overcorrection involves having the student practice appropriate behavior in an exaggerated way. Two types.
Restitutional overcorrection.
That's where the student has to restore the environment they disturb and then make it even better. Made a mess, clean it up, plus maybe polish the table too.
And positive practice overcorrection.
That involves practicing the correct behavior repeatedly, often in an exaggerated way. Lined up wrong. Practice lining up correctly 5 times.
Sounds potentially effective, but also potentially time-consuming and might require physical guidance sometimes, which brings its own concerns.
Definitely management concerns, needs teacher attention, can be effortful for everyone involved.
Wow, okay. That's a whirlwind tour through all 4 levels. So let's try to sort of wrap this up for you, our listener.
Yeah, the big takeaway is understanding this hierarchy. These different levels give you a framework.
And that principle of the least intrusive alternative is key, isn't it? Always start with level I, those reinforcement-based positive strategies.
Absolutely. And always consider the function of the behavior. Why is it happening? That guides your choice of intervention more than anything.
We really hope this deep dive has given you some, aha moments, maybe some practical ideas. We covered a lot, from the nuances of DR procedures to the complexities of extinction, the very careful use of those later levels.
The challenges ABA professionals face are real, no doubt. But having this solid understanding of the principles is just crucial for making positive change happen.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Think about a challenging behavior you might be dealing with right now, or one you've seen. How could applying that least intrusive principle, really thinking about the why behind the behavior, maybe lead you towards a more positive, maybe more sustainable approach from level I?
Something to consider. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in to ABA Chapter Chat. We'll catch you next time.